So with that, I'll get started on introducing this evening. And we have a series of lightning talks from the Everyday Postwar Mobilities group. And thank you to all of our speakers for all of your participation and organisation and everything that it takes to get this many people in one place giving talks. So thank you so much for that. So the Everyday Mobilities group is an emergent forum for historians and other scholars who are interested in the social, political, economic and cultural dimensions of routine daily mobility. Their interdisciplinary work explores mobilities and mobile subjects, often overlooked historiographically, and they use this work to respond to pressing problems and contemporary political concerns, from the climate emergency and deteriorating air quality to active travel and accessible cities. The group just formed towards the end of last year, and so they're very keen to attract further members into a possible network. So you're very welcome to reach out and make contact after the event. And I think we're going to have a really great sense of their research interests from the 6 talks that we have this evening, which we will hear from and then take questions at the end. So I'm going to hand over first just to Martin to do a bit more of an introduction on the group and say a few more words, and then we will get going with this lineup.
Always help to unmute. Thanks, Charlotte. Or maybe not. Maybe it would have been better if I had stayed muted. That might be more interesting. So thanks everybody for coming. Yeah, I hope I won't speak for too much longer and to really add to what Charlotte's already said. Yeah, we're a very new group, and I hope group is the kind of correct term. Maybe a flamboyance of historians might have been better, but I think I think the key thing is not to make us sound too cohesive. I think we're a group of scholars who are interested in everyday forms of travel and getting around. It's sort of very broadly conceived. I think we connected with each other over some shared historical interests, and we sort of had a bit of a group discussion over what we might foreground here. So we've sort of come up with a few points about, for instance, how mobility narratives and imaginaries have shaped and been shaped by popular understandings of class, race, gender, and age. The ways in which mobility choices have been made under asymmetrical social, racial, cultural, environmental and infrastructural constraints, the interaction of different modalities of travel and of modal users, and how these everyday mobilities have shaped everyday environments, the way that people move around on a daily basis and how this affects their understanding of themselves, their communities and the world around them. And I think just to, again, sort of foreground some of those questions of vulnerability and marginalization within mobility politics and design, as well as in mobility historiography. So there's a kind of very broad set, I think, of questions and topics that we've been very sort of having preliminary discussions about. And today, I think the aim is just to give a flavour through a kind of series of snapshots, really, of this this breadth of interest, and give a flavour of the conversations that we might have going forward. Again, just to sort of underline what Charlotte opened with, I think the key thing for us is that the direction of the group and this discussion is not set. So we're really wanting to need people to join and make contact with us. There's a QR code, I believe, on the slide that we put up, and a link in the chat to a mailing list. If you'd like to kind of join that would be fantastic. And also feel free to share widely. And the hope is that we can develop a lively network with an evolving intellectual agenda. So again, we're very, I'm going to have a series of mobility puns through my sort of contributions today, because I can't resist that. Sort of dad jokes, basically. So really the sort of direction is not set. I think that's the key thing, and we're really looking to sort of to move that on. We have some events coming up at which you can see some of our work if you're interested at greater length, and perhaps again to make contact with us too if you're sort of interested in the work that we're doing. So there'll be an event in Exeter as a workshop in July, the 4th and 5th of July, on broadly on sort of cultural, environmental, political histories of everyday mobility. There'll be a Zoom link for that available on a registration page going up shortly. So if you're interested in that, the dates again are sort of Thursday 4th of July and Friday 5th of July. And then at the large 2TM conference in Leipzig in September, Tina, Tifane and Silke have a panel there with some others on protected modes of contested ground, histories of traffic, activism and politics. So again, be a panel if you want to catch up. So with that, I think it's probably best I move into the papers, unless any of the other speakers, members of the group, want to kind of correct or add anything to that sort of introduction. Okay, great. In which case, I'll hand back to you, Charlotte. Thanks.
Great, thank you for that introduction. That's brilliant. So we'll start tonight with Elsa Devienne, who is Assistant Professor in US History at Northumbria University. And her first book, The Sand Rush, Revival of the Beach in 20th Century Los Angeles, won the 2021 Willie Paul Adams Award, awarded by the Organization of American Historians. And she's an expert in environmental history, urban history, particular interests in sustainable mobilities, leisure, gender, sexuality, and the body. So over to you, Elsa.
All right, unmute. Thank you very much, Charlotte, for this introduction. So I was in LA last week presenting my book, but I'm very far from beaches right now because I'm going to be talking about the school run in Britain, and I am still jet lagged. I have not really gone back to my work on sustainable mobilities in a while, so please apologies, and apologies to John and Charlotte, who already know a little bit about this research. But in any case, like I think some of us here, at least John is another example. I came to the history of mobilities and transport through my own experience, trying to move around in Britain and finding it very hard indeed. And every morning having a mental breakdown every time I try to drop off my children. And, you know, it's a very, very difficult experience, and I'm not the only one. Indeed, it's been a long time since British parents I've complained about the so-called school run. In fact, in 1993, so it was like 30 years ago now, in the column of The Time, journalist Margot Norman was already wondering why parents and children were enduring that deadly crawl through clouds of poisonous gas. Surely, she reflected, the time had come to abolish that barbaric twice daily ritual. Now, British parents have definitely not abolished it. In fact, the figures speak for themselves. Lots of children were still walking to school in the 80s, but that number has declined very rapidly. And there's some hope because in 2022, as you can see, the numbers show that there's a slight reversal of the trend towards being driven to school. Nonetheless, it's still, these are still not very good figures in terms of air pollution and mobility of children, independent mobility. Now, this is such an iconic parenting experience that, of course, in Britain, the land where we just make jokes out of our misery, this became, you know, fodder for jokes in the TV show Motherland. You may be familiar with it. So in the first episode, the main character, Julia, as you can see, she's a very stressed out mother of two, and we see her flouting traffic rules, going through a red light. And this is a show that's premised on relatability. So of course, we're all supposed to be thinking, yeah, sure, that's how it happens. That's how it is, isn't it? So how did we get there? Why has it become such a hallmark of British everyday life? The fact that we drive to school and we drive each other mad driving to school. Well, I don't, but you know, some people do. And so responding to that question, of course, I can turn to the historical literature on car dominance and the transformation of the built environment in the post-war period. I can turn to the rich literature in mobility studies on children's independent mobility. And there are indeed many factors I can mention: the rise in car ownership, transformation of the built environment, women's increased participation in the workforce, the changing patterns of the workforce, the advent of parental choice in education, the decline in public transport, stranger danger, very, very important in the 1990s. These are important factors, but they don't explain everything. And what I'm trying to do in this paper, which hopefully will become an article and then might become something else, but I don't know yet what, is kind of like turn towards also cultural history and social history to understand the Volvo culture, the Chelsea tractors, the obsession with car status, that is the performance of class and motherhood and parenthood at the school gates, and also understanding why the school run and air pollution have become part of the British culture war? How is it that the school run has become political? So the school run, interestingly enough, is a very recent expression. We see it really coming in the 1990s. As you see, I've done a really quick graph here showing how it shows up in the press from the 70s till today. It really becomes big around the time the New Labour tries to do something about it and tries to get more children to walk to school. That's when the war on the school run comes up as an expression. And then in the 2000, again, there's another attempt at doing more. In any case, this is definitely a very, very important issue. What I see is the importance indeed of images and culture of driving to school has been really promoted by ads in particular. Those narratives that driving to school is normal are being circulated in the news, but also on TV, showing parents driving to school and showing those parents as doing what is right. So usually at this point, I show one of these ads, but I don't have time here. Another trope that's really interesting is that of the bad mother, bad driver, which shows women as being these menace in the street. So it's extremely sexist. So that's another trope I'm really interested in. And interestingly, that trope then gets used as a feminist icon when it's convenient by those who are anti active travel, those who try, the pro-car people, in other words, reframe women as victims of active travel policies in the 1990s and early 2000s. You know, Theresa May saying that those are women who are targeted by these attempts at getting more people to walk to school. So that's it for now. What I really wanted to say here is, yes, my interest in looking at those perception and representation and seeing how cultural history can help us understand how norms are built through the recirculation and repetition of these narratives and these stereotypes. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much. Really interesting. So we'll move straight on without further ado to our second speaker, who is Tina Maanistö-Funk, who is a historian of technology working at the University of Turku in Finland. She's currently an Academy Research Fellow financed by the Academy of Finland with a project that studies the history of non-motorised modes and the change in Finnish living environments. And she's also the PI of a project focusing on questions of equality and justice in cities, funded by the Cone Foundation. Thanks, Tina.
Thanks. So let's see. I will try to share my screen, and I guess you should see it now, right? And you hear me. My computer tells me that my internet is unstable, so if I freeze, let's see. But well, I cannot do anything about it now. I thought I'll just try to give you a short glimpse about my interests, my research interests right now, and this is the project funded by Academy of Finland, where I'm studying the change of living environments in Finland from 1950s to end of 1980s. And the main idea with this project was that we always talk so much about motorization, but the other modes go on. And I want to look at the role they have played in these changing urban environments during this era. And I'm now going to talk about three concepts very briefly that I find interesting right now. And those are spatiality, activism, and gender. Oh, can I move on or not? Let's see. Yes, I can. So here you see some comic art, which is from my other project. You see the web page link or the webpage down there. This is by Tiitu Takalo, who is right now candidate for Eisner Award, so the comic Oscar, so to say. So she's a really good comic artist, and I have worked with her in a project which looks at questions of equality and justice in urban environments through historical research and art. But now here I show her art to refer to the tremendous change in living environments that happened in Finland, starting especially from the 50s, after the post-war lack of funds. In the 50s, Finland started to change very rapidly. I mean, many places changed, but Finland was very rural until after the Second World War. So this was also the time when people really moved into the cities, and the cities grew, and the suburbs were built, but also the city centers changed a lot. And I want to look at the role of cycling and walking in this tremendous change, material and societal change. And I'm interested in spatial equality and how it was discussed during this time, but also in general the meanings and uses and conflicts around urban space while it was changing so rapidly. So right now, I'm, for example, writing an article about urban trees and how urban trees played a role in urban activism during that time. The other concept that I'm interested in right now is activism, so linking to the tree article, for example, but I have also otherwise looked at transport activism during that time. You see a photo from a demonstration, from a pedestrian demonstration in Helsinki in 1970, and the sign says city center for the pedestrians. And I'm interested in this transport activism as kind of situated knowledge, but also as a struggle for definitions. Who gets to define, for example, what is a pedestrian and what kind of role in technocracy was something that was criticized, but also somehow used by the activists. And I see the 1960s and also the early 70s kind of a window of opportunity when the transport system was really discussed in a new way, and it was becoming a political question. And it's interesting to see how questions of equality were used in this discussion and criticism. But I'm also asking, why was this criticism not more successful? Because many other types of activism actually achieved many of their goals. For example, women's activism for women's rights in Finland was very successful in achieving its goals, but transport activism much less so. So I find this interesting. And I, of course, see also many connections to the present day discussions about urban space and justice in the discussions back then. So last slide, and don't be afraid, you don't have to be able to read what is in the pictures or even understand them at all, because I will quite briefly tell you about them. So gender Okay, Elsa was already talking about the role of gender, and I think this is something that needs to be studied much more, both in history of transport and also in present day, because it has such tremendous impact, and gender has impact on the mobilities, and the mobilities have impact on gender, and it's actually quite surprising how little it has been studied when you look at the statistics. So here on the right side, you see a picture from the very first Finnish passenger traffic study, which came out 1977, but was based on the questionnaires done in 1974. And of course, you cannot understand it, or maybe somebody reads Finnish, that would be a surprise. But what you see there, the first, what are those called? The first part of the graph is are the men, the second are the women, and the third are the children. And if you look at the first one, you see the biggest part of it is full of dots, and that dotted part is passenger car travel. So men were already mainly using passenger car for their daily travels. But if you compare with women and children, you see that they were not. So this is really like, there is a huge difference, for example, in car use. So we need to look at that more deeply. And then just to conclude, on the left side, you see a little example from the huge archive one female activist left behind. She was called Anneli Alanen, and she became very active in transport questions when she filled 50 years. She had 7 children, and she became a slow street activist. And she used her gendered experience of traffic as a person without driving license and with many children as an argument, and I find it extremely interesting. And here, just to show an example how she used this situated knowledge, is she has transformed this kind of model share of traffic modes, which is in the picture on the right hand side from the mid-80s, like how many kilometers are driven by what mode. She has transformed it into another kind of model share, where she looks at the time spent on the street, and she says, well, the ones who are the most on the street are the slowest, and they are the old people, the people with children, the people using bicycles or walking. So those are actually the ones we should look at, and the ones who have most knowledge about the street, because they are there the most. So I conclude here. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you so much. It's really interesting. Next we move on to Martin Moore, who's a lecturer in medical history at the University of Exeter and has previously worked on histories of diabetes, healthcare management, and temporalities of care in Britain's National Health Service. His current work explores histories of commuting in post-war Britain and their intersection with questions of health and well-being. Thank you.
Thanks, Charlotte. Yes. So today I'm just going to share and outline briefly some work I've been doing around post-war histories of commuting, and in particular how looking at how the sort of regular journey to work has been framed in terms of health and well-being. So it's really going to be not much kind of those kind of case studies or materials, but more kind of looking at some of the questions that I've been interested in. And sort of forewarned about the mobility puns. This has been work I've been doing for a little while, but it's been quite stop and start and not been able to get much sort of momentum. So the hope is that this is a kind of going to be a period of sustained work on this, and it'd be really great to get some feedback from people that are, you know, as I'm a kind of interloper in the mobilities field, so it'd be really good to get some kind of expert feedback, if you like, from people that have been working on that rather than me as a historian of medicine. So see if I can change the slide. Yes, I'll avoid the sort of preamble is the way this has come from, but effectively I'm a historian of medicine who's commuted for 10 years, so it was a kind of almost natural fit, and it's responding to some of those sort of health issues that we'd outlined in the introduction to the so some questions that I've been thinking through, and then sort of maybe some reflections on what their historiographical benefit might be. So firstly, in a very basic sense, I've been interested in mapping when, in particular, anxieties about commuting's effects on health and well-being first emerged, sort of, so what period and in what context have these sort of been drawn out. Then been thinking about how concerns about health and well-being in relation to commuting have been framed and managed culturally and politically. So asking questions, asking kind of how discussions of health have drawn on wider languages and sources of meaning to be communicated, whose health has been considered and prioritized in different moments, and how has well-being been weighted against other competing concerns, economic imperatives, political projects, etc. And finally, I'm kind of becoming increasingly interested, I think, in the question of kind of material conditions and social relations and how they've produced certain types of mobility. So how has commuting made health and illness historically? And it's a kind of a question I'd like to take forward. So there is obviously this rich history, I think, of works around commuting. I'll sort of put some text on the board, but, you know, thinking particularly Joe Moran's work on new norms of behaviour around commuting, Colin Pooley and Jean Turnbull and colleagues' work, particularly on sort of mapping distances and changing modalities and duration of commutes since the sort of start of the 20th century. Simeon Cools and Ovar Lofgren have worked on how these sorts of norms and behaviours also connected with complex emotional histories, which I think kind of brings an interesting lens to it. And they draw attention to sort of distinct temporalities, so repetitions, suspensions, liminality, and how they inform certain feelings of anxiety, boredom, danger, excitement for people positioned differently within sort of social field. And finally, there's sort of been works on, obviously, the commuting's links with suburbia and the sort of development of new urban spaces, and how that itself became kind of pathologized over the sort of 20th century in particular. So my hope is that by turning to those kind of questions of health and well-being, we can sort of see commuting in some novel ways and develop on some of that work that's already been done. And I'll just share sort of three brief thoughts on that, I guess, to sort of generate some feedback. So the first, I guess, is thinking about what commuting's pathologies can tell us about broader social, political, and cultural anxieties. So worries about commuting and their impacts on well-being is rarely actually about commuting. So I think taking one example of the 1970s, doctors who were looking at commuting increasingly connected it with some physiology of tension, stress, and heart disease. And it became sort of framed in some ways in relation to this notion of the Western way of death and sort of diseases of Western civilization. So on the one hand, this sort of framing extends sort of some well-known, I think, and a long history of the site of articulating sort of cultural ambivalence around modernity in relation to the body. Scholars like Sally Shuttleworth has sort of shown. And I think commuting has a kind of distinctive aspect here, in as much as it's sort of through repetition, it converts the shock of the new into something that's kind of quite endemic and mundane, but no less dangerous for being so. And on the other hand, I think these framings, it's sort of telling that it emerges in particular around the 1970s when there's these discourses of imperial decline and that industrial decline, and they're at their peak. So I think it's speaking to these sort of broader concerns about declinism. I can't go into the sort of artistic representation at this point, but again, I think that sort of links into these notions of crisis around sort of midlife, and in particular around sort of white male heterosexuality at this point too, but I'll move on from that. The second historiographic contribution then might be to think about how understandings and considerations of health shape the kind of cultural artifacts of commuting, the sort of routines and environments within which that took place. So we can think about, for instance, the decline of the smoking carriage on the rail network, the sort of development of green alternatives to travel as they sort of filtered into, say, local council policies, and even the sort of marketing of commuting around sort of things like British Rail's adverts to try and increase their kind of market share of travel. So there are some of the examples on the screen. And then we can also think about where the sort of commuting became a focal point for local and transnational political action, as well as its limits. So why, for instance, kind of persistent critiques of health inequalities as it related to sort of mobility and immobility have been ineffective towards drives for automobility, for instance. And then finally, sort of reading commuting in health might help shift histories of medicine too, I think, beyond the focus, or at least my own work, beyond the focus on sort of healthcare institutions and governmental interventions. So just sort of thinking about Virginia Park's notion of commuting as a sort of racial mobility project. We shift the gaze from commuters to workers, we could connect a kind of well-known commuting world of, for instance, Reggie Perrin, who's probably sort of the archetypal commuter in the sort of mid to late 20th century, and with sort of post-war histories of migration, gendered double burdens, and Black British citizenship. So you're thinking about occupational health in sort of transport workers, that might shed a light on how intersectional marginalization became literally embodied by the labor who produced commuting in the everyday. So in that sense, again, we can kind of consider how political economies and relationships of power shape the body's material states. So I mean, that's just to kind of throw some mud on the wall in some ways to sort of get some sort of feedback. But there's sort of numerous ways it could go, and I'd be really interested in basically just sort of hearing your thoughts. So I've used up my time and I'll pass over there, but it'd be great to hear what people think. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much for that. So we'll move on now to John Monroe, who teaches US history at the University of Birmingham. He is author of The Anti-Colonial Front, The African-American Freedom Struggle and Global Decolonization, and with Radhika Natarajan of the Public Books Imperialism Syllabus. He's also on the advisory board of the Movements and Mobility Forum. Thank you.
Thanks, Charlotte. And hi, everybody. It's nice to be here and talk about this kind of emerging work. Like several people here, I'm quite new to the mobility studies field. And I'm a historian of the United States, as was mentioned. And my book that I wrote was about the connections between the African-American freedom struggle and global decolonization. And so there's always been a kind of global and imperial sort of lens with which I view US history, and that remains in place as I try to think my way into the mobility studies field. And like Elsa, I'm also in the mobility studies field because I moved to, in my case, Birmingham, where I just was in shock at first, to be honest, just about how the roads were designed in a way to make it just so dangerous for people to cross them if they weren't driving a car. So I've begun to move, and so I've been asking myself, how did that come to be, and trying to think my way into that. And so I've started a little bit. I wrote a blog post about infrastructure, looking at a case in San Francisco in particular. And so I've made a couple of sort of forays into this field, and I've also started a website called Movements and Mobilities with a colleague looking at the connection between activism and mobility studies. So there's a couple of things, but it's just really a beginning. So it's also nice for me to be in this emerging network. The current project that I'm trying to develop is called Stealing Cars, as you see on the slide there. And what I mean by that is not people stealing cars, but rather cars stealing space from people. And I'm interested in the relationship between automobility, property, and theft. And the central claim, as far as I've got with it, again, looking at a long sort of historical view, is that private property evolved through the theft generating international system of empire. and that perceiving automobility as an expression of that system has implications for how car-dominated spaces might be reimagined and repurposed today. So the project has kind of three components to it. The first is to just historicize property relations. And again, that entails looking at empire and thinking about the ways that private property became so dominant through the rendering of land as property, obviously in racial slavery as one of the most horrific examples in the development of property. And so thinking about the kinds of property relationships that already came into existence before the ascendancy of the automobile. So looking at the rise of automobility in that context already in place. And then secondly, looking at automobility itself, I'm interested in thinking about the continuities from, I guess, what David Harvey called Fordism to flexible accumulation. And what I'm thinking about there is, rather than thinking about the Fordist system as the opposite of neoliberalism, thinking about the ways that in the Fordist factories, auto workers were manufacturing cars, but they were also building a kind of individualist sensibility by churning out these very vehicles that individuals would use to get around on city streets, and in ever increasing number, demanding ever increasing space to do so. And third, I'm also interested in the policy implications of this. I feel like this work is policy relevant, and I'm kind of interested in it for that reason. I want to be part of a conversation, and which is why it's very nice to be with the present company here, with people who are looking at different ways of thinking about mobility and activism, but really with the point to transform the streets of our cities and the public space of our cities in ways that are more equitable, in ways that don't mean that owning a car is a prerequisite to be able to getting around the place where you live in safety and dignity. And so there's also things about the policy implications that connect to the imperial history. And one question I'm interested in particular is the ways that police are sometimes viewed as the kind of the obvious solution to the problems of automobility. If people who don't have cars are being endangered, then the police should enforce the rules so that the drivers drive more safely. But if we think about what police are and how they arrive out of an imperial history and the kinds of inequalities that police are actually meant to enforce, that might make us rethink the role of police and maybe refocus on infrastructure as another possible way of thinking through these questions. So right now I'm trying to think about the Stealing Cars project as something that could be an online essay or maybe a short book. But again, I'm really interested in the practical applications, and just really excited to be entering into this field with the folks that are here and those that will join us. So thank you.
Excellent, thank you very much. So our fifth speaker this evening is Tiffaine Roberts, who is a historian and postdoctoral fellow at the Laboratory of Urban Sociology at the École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne and at the Rachel Carson Centre in Munich. Her research project, The Autocratic Automobile, A Political History of the Car in Switzerland, 1950 to 2000, is funded by the Swiss National Research Fund. And Tiffaine is preparing a new research project on restricted walking, history of pedestrian mobility in the automotive age, Switzerland 1920 to 2020, looking at the evolution of the legitimacy of pedestrian traffic in public spaces in Switzerland through discourses on pedestrians and the pedestrian traffic infrastructure. She's also worked as a collaborator at Unidistance Switzerland since 2020. So thank you.
So hi everyone, thank you very much Charlotte for the introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to publicize our new group and present snapshot of our research. Yes, I will present today my new project that I just submitted to the Swiss National Science Foundation. Restricted walking, history of pedestrian mobility in the automotive age. Oops. Yeah, just a few words about my current project that I'm finishing this summer. The study is focused on two topics. The first one is the car pollution, and the second one is the highway buildings in Switzerland. This first postdoc was based on the archives of automobile clubs, which played an important role in the motorization of Switzerland, but also in other Western countries. In Switzerland, the most important one is the Touring Club Suisse. I did spend quite a lot of time in this building, in its archives. There, I have found more and more archives concerning pedestrians and their handling by the car community and by actors of mobility politics, which will be the focus of this new project. I propose two main angles to address this topic in the pedestrian history of pedestrian mobility. I will look at the discourses on pedestrians, particularly in road safety campaigns. You can see here a current symbol, the hen, used by authorities and safety organizations to describe the indecisive behavior of pedestrians. And my second angle is the material handling of pedestrians. I like this example. It shows very well this idea of restricted walking. I think the architect here didn't forget maybe the most emblematic pedestrian, the housewife, but he depicted her facing stairs. So I don't know how this woman is supposed to get up the stairs with her buggy. Both examples show the big paradox I want to study. Discourses and infrastructure like pavement and pedestrian crossing or subway traffic lights were supposed to increase pedestrian safety, but at the same time, they brought new problems for the pedestrians, like taking long detours, waiting at traffic lights, possibly exposing oneself to danger in the case of underground passages, for instance, so much so that life as a pedestrian became very difficult, especially in the post-war period. As you know, the pedestrian population was mostly made of elderly housewives, children, workers, so politically underrepresented classes who suffered under the unequal sharing of the street. Since the 1970s, there were big improvements like car-free zones or speed limits, but they didn't really challenge car domination in Western societies. The car lobby remains an important actor in road safety today. Campaigns still emphasize the behavior of vulnerable and appeal to their visibility. In Switzerland, the Touring Club Suisse distributes this harness to all school children and previously yellow caps in the 1960s. So to carry out this project, I will use archives of lobbies, car lobby, of course, but also leagues that defended pedestrian, like the Swiss Pedestrian Association founded in the 1950s, and the fascinating the Fußgänger journal of this association. The local press and the municipal archives will also be useful to explore the debates about pedestrian infrastructure. Just one example here, the small pedestrian area was cancelled due to an engineer's opinion that these too big pedestrian areas made them feel insecure. So this takeover, meaning the eviction of pedestrians to the side, took place around 100 years ago. And I want to try to historicize the difficulty of overcoming motor normativity in terms of discourse and in terms of infrastructure. In fact, there is a big gap between the encouragement to walk and the reality of infrastructure, in particular in the peri-urban area. This is here, it's here an example next to Geneva. I think understanding this history allows to denormalize the motor normativity and hierarchies, the hierarchies to which we are so accustomed. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you. The screen share, that would be great.
I cannot share yet. Stefan, can you close?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm looking for.
Okay.
I'm trying to this share, but I cannot find the.
I might be. I don't know if Mike.
Yes. No, it's okay. I'm sorry.
That's okay. Thank you. Really interesting. Thanks so much. So our final speaker this evening is Silke Zimmer-Merkel, postdoctoral researcher at the Institute of Technology Futures History Department at Karlsruhe Institute of Technology. And her fields of expertise and research interests include the history of technology and mobility, as well as cultural history and history of ideas. In her ongoing research project, she investigates historical types and meanings of children's mobility, and currently she's carrying out a research and exchange semester at Dresden University of Technology Institute of History. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Charlotte, for the nice intro. And thank you to also to Elsa and Martin for bringing our network to life and us together in this setting today. As Charlotte already mentioned in the introduction, I'm a historian of technology with a particular interest in mobility, as well as cultural history and the history of ideas. In my PhD thesis, I had been working on the history of driving assistance systems in the car, and the results are finally published and can be downloaded open access. The link is on my slide, and I think in the chat as well. Thanks to Mike. The book is in German. I hope, though, to being able to publish at least an article with some main findings in English soon. So now on my current research, for my postdoc project, I have decided to write a series of papers loosely tied together by the topic of children's mobilities. By the way, do you see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, because for me they are gone now. Nevertheless, yeah, tied together by the topic of children's mobilities. Not having to decide now which papers I'm going to write throughout the next years is a freedom I'm going to, or currently are fully making use of, and it's both a curse and blessing. Nevertheless, before I open up the field of my research interest, I want to speak briefly about what drives me and my research interest. First of all, it's the issue of adultism. Modern societies, Western society in particular, are quite hostile to children and families. Traffic and areas for playing are an obvious example for that, and we have already touched on this in some of the other papers tonight. And I think this circumstance urgently needs to be historicized. I think it's important that we are aware of it and that we also have an historical perspective on that. Secondly, mobility is one field of the fields of the grand challenges of our times. At the same time, it is hardly known, or better, hardly scientifically analyzed, how diverse human mobility can look like. What it can be more than the usual modes we as adults think of usually, and how childhood experiences can influence our mobility as adults. a footnote to the last one, mobility study and sense of transport science. So sociologically to research on this topic. A historical perspective, though, is missing and could, however, be insightful. So now on my fields of interest, as I already mentioned, I do not have a streamlined project yet, but use the freedom to follow my broad interest on a historical perspective on children's mobility. So the question I'm always going to ask, and which connects my different topics and case studies that I'm planning, is how have children in the past moved themselves and how have they been moved by others? As you see, this allows really for a variety of topics, from ways to school over play mobility, like, for example, a history of pedal cars, to a historical study of how babies have been moved around, like in strollers, carried in wraps, in the past. I would really be interested to do research on different epochs and over different cultures, but I myself will not be able to do all of that and alone. I will mainly work on the modern history aspect of it. So I'm always interested to get in touch with other scholars who are interested in the topic, and also and especially in interdisciplinary settings and contexts. Now, to finally give at least one example of my work, the case study I just started out is a comparison of traffic education and the discourse of the dangerousness of traffic for children in the two Germanys, not the whole countries, but two exemplary cities. They are Karlsruhe and Dresden. Why these two now? I'm currently a visiting scholar at the Technical University of Dresden. So it's a sensible thing to do, to use the archives of both locations to see on the one hand side what we can find in the archives on this topic, but also to compare these two German cities in their different history and the discourses on the topic. So having already reached my 5 minutes mark, I'm closing with an outlook. I will be talking about more on the topic of the two German cities and their traffic education in my paper at the T2N conference in Leipzig, which is not far from Dresden, actually. So I'm looking forward to perhaps meet some of you there and get in touch. Thank you.